Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the Ryobi p2080 18-volt string trimmer / edger. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, starting off at the rear of the tool, we have the 18-volt battery slot. Overall, the 18-volt battery slot will accept any of Ryobi's 18-volt batteries, and the batteries lock in nice and securely. There really is no wiggle, and overall I have no complaints about how well the battery slot works on this particular tool. So it gets a pass. Okay, next up we have the grip. The grip on this particular tool is fairly nice. It has a nice rubberized texture and it's comfortable to hold. Overall, the rubberized texture will help prevent vibrations from reaching your hands as strongly, and also will help keep your hands in place if your hands get sweaty. So overall, the grip on this particular tool gets a pass. Next up we have the safety. The safety is a long plastic, reverse trigger, I guess, that it comes out of the top of the tool, and in order to activate the trigger you have to press it down and then you will be able to pull the trigger, activating the motor on the trimmer head. Overall, this is an interesting design. It's not really my personal preference when it comes to a safety, but it is functional and it does work, so it gets a pass, although personally I'm not a fan of this design. And next up we have the trigger. The trigger on this particular tool is a variable speed trigger which provides good definition in between the different speeds. Overall, it is a paddle style trigger and it works fairly decently. I personally would have preferred a more traditional pull style trigger, but at the end of the day the trigger that they include is functional and I don't really have any major complaints about it. It's a long piece of plastic which is fairly flexible, so I don't really think you're going to have to worry about it breaking as long as you don't leave it out in the sun where it could get hard and brittle over time. So at the end of the day, the trigger gets a pass on this particular tool. And next up we have the mode selection switch. The mode selection switch will allow you to switch between mode 1, which is the lower speed mode, and mode 2, which is the higher speed mode. Overall, the switch is perfectly adequate and it works just fine. There really isn't that big of a noticeable difference in between the high and low modes, but there is a little bit of a difference, and I am glad that they gave you the option because I always like having more options than the less options. So this also gets a pass. And next up we have the forward handle. Now the forward handle on this particular tool is fairly decent. You can adjust the positioning of the handle side to side or forward or backwards via the knob on the side, and it will lock into place fairly securely. So overall I am fairly happy with just the overall performance there. You can also slide the handle up and down on the shaft in order to increase the area or the length or how far it is from your arms in order for you to be able to hold on to it better depending on the length of your arms. So overall, I don't have any real major complaints about the trimmer handle. The handle itself is made out of a hard plastic with a rubberized texture, and it is fairly comfortable to grip, and you can control the trimmer fairly accurately with it. So at the end of the day, this will also get a pass. And next up we have the coupler. Now the coupler on this tool will connect the lower shaft to the upper shaft, and it does a fairly decent job. It's made out of a hard plastic, and I don't think you're going to have any issues with this particular coupler because it seems to be made out of a very thick and high quality plastic. So I'm perfectly happy with just the overall performance coming from the coupler. When you connect the lower shaft to the upper part of the body, it's basically kind of like almost plugging in a power cord to an outlet almost, because the motor head is located on the head of the trimmer and not at the upper body of the trimmer by where the battery is. And we'll talk a little bit why this might not have been the best design choice in a minute, but overall the coupler on this particular tool is fairly decent and I don't have any complaints about it. And next up we have the motor head. Now the motor head is located at the base of the shaft, and overall it provides plenty of power and it does a fairly good job at just keeping the trimmer head going in a variety of different situations. So overall the motor gets a pass, although I'm not too crazy about the placement or just the overall design, but we'll talk about that more here in a second. And next up we have the foot pedal. The foot pedal is used for transitioning the trimmer into an edger or vice versa. Overall, it is somewhat functional. It has springs inside that are supposed to lock it into position or switch into position when you press down the foot pedal, but they're not strong enough to fully transition the weed whacker into the proper position, so you end up having to finish it with your foot or your hand in order for it to be converted into the different mode. Overall, this isn't a huge deal breaker, but at the end of the day, this is just not my favorite design when it comes to a trimmer. I personally like having trimmers that have the motor up at the top of the handle to protect the motor from debris such as dust or grass clippings or moisture that might get into the motor housing, and having the motor down low close to the ground means that you're going to get more debris and more stuff into the motor compartment, which means that it will probably shorten the life of the motor because it won't be able to adequately disperse the heat, and there's a chance that it could short out if enough moisture moisture gets into the compartment. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of this design, but this is what this tool is meant to do, so it gets a pass. But I think that the foot pedal needs a little bit of a redesign, or maybe possibly stronger springs in order to transition it into the proper mode. And next up we have the wheel for when you're in edging mode. Overall the wheel is adequate and it does its job, although I'm not sure just how tough it is. I don't do a lot of edging. Well, actually I don't do any edging. So quite frankly, I'm not really sure how robust and how long this wheel will last, but at least they included a wheel and it does help with the overall purpose of the tool. So it gets a pass. And next up we have the trimmer line cutting blade. Now the trimmer line cutting blade is reversible, so you can either have it cutting the length of the trimmer line at the 11th inch mark or at a 13-inch mark. So overall it is a perfectly acceptable design and it works just fine, so it gets a pass. Okay, now let's talk about the guard. The guard does a good job of protecting against any sort of flying debris that might be coming up from this rotating cutting head. But at the same time, because of how large it is, it has a nasty habit of, well, becoming a boat anchor because of all the debris that cakes onto the bottom of the guard. This will definitely make the guard much heavier, and because the guard is much larger, that means there's a lot more area for debris to cake onto. Now, this isn't going to be a major issue if you're younger and you have plenty of upper body strength, but if you're older, this will probably be a bit of a downside and possibly a deal breaker. I will say that there's other reasons why this isn't the most comfortable trimmer to hold or use, simply because, well, it's not exactly the most well-balanced trimmer. You have most of the weight at the front of the trimmer, with the exception of the battery, which is at the back. And unless you're using a massive battery, it's going to become front heavy, and this is going to definitely contribute to the, well, usability of this over long periods of time. So at the end of the day, is this a deal breaker? No, but I would definitely say that this is more for a quick and easy trimming scenario rather than long trimming jobs. So that's just something else to keep in mind if you are intending to buy this particular trimmer. And next up we have the cutting head or the trimmer head. Now the trimmer head on this particular trimmer can be used in two different configurations. One with the more traditional trimmer line, where a single trimmer line feed will come out and it will be an auto feed, so whenever you need more you simply let up on the trigger and more line will come out. Or you can use it with the Ryobi's optional plastic serrated blade head, which will have two different serrated plastic blades on either side, and this head actually works fairly decently for cutting through tougher weeds that trimmer line typically can't cut through. So either way you decide to use it, I don't really have any complaints about just the performance that I was getting from this trimmer head. I was actually a little bit surprised how well it worked, and it worked really well for my particular needs. And so this also gets a pass. Okay, with a 4 amp hour battery, the tool weighs 3,482 grams, which is a little bit over 7.5 pounds. So the website description when it comes to the weight is actually fairly accurate. So that is nice to see. Okay, let's talk about the overall performance of the tool. Overall, this tool actually did a fairly decent job when it comes to cutting through dry and brittle weeds. It did a good job of cutting through the weeds that were taller and without having the weeds wrap around and clogging up the cutting head or jamming up just the spool. And it did a good job on the shorter grass at cutting through and not just leaving it. And so, quite frankly, I'm fairly happy with the overall performance when it comes to working with dry plants or weeds. So yeah, moving on. Okay, let's talk about the performance when it comes to your average weeds that have water in them and your average grasses that have water in them, unlike most of the grasses in our yard. Now, this particular weed whacker does a fairly decent job, and I was surprised just how well it worked. I think if it had double line on either side of the trimmer head like a lot of standard weed whackers, it would have been more effective, but it still had a decent performance, and you only have to take a double pass on the occasional thick patch of weeds or grasses. So I think it's still an acceptable performance, and so it gets a pass in this category as well. Now, when it comes to cutting through weeds that are more jungle-like in nature, your burdock, your thistle, your cocklebur, the trimmer line just isn't going to cut it, but that is to be expected. Now, the trimmer blade heads that have the serrated plastic blades on them that you can buy separately actually work fairly decently when it comes to dealing with your larger variety of weeds. And I was pretty happy with the overall performance when it came to cutting through this thistle in the middle of our septic field. So overall, I am very happy with the performance with the serrated teeth heads when it comes to cutting through weeds. So yeah, it gets a pass here as well. Okay, now, when using this trimmer in edging mode, the performance is, well, I'm not really going to be the best judge when it comes to that, to be completely frank and honest with you. I don't think I've ever really had to edge anything in my life, and where I live, that's just not something people usually have to do. Now, the edging mode did do a fairly decent job at, well, cutting a little hole in the dirt here, but I know that's not what you use an edger for. I just don't have any actual grass to edge. So, quite frankly, this is going to have to remain sort of a mystery and up to you. I will say that I think that you're going to wear out those plastic serrated blades fairly quickly if you're using it in edging mode, and if you're using trimmer line, you're going to burn through trimmer line really fast. So I would probably recommend buying a dedicated edger that would have a steel blade that would hold up better over time. But that's just my own personal preference. And yes, I know the video I just showed had nothing to do with edging, but I didn't really have any other videos to show you that had edging in it. So yeah, moving on to the pros and cons. And first up, 18 volt. 18 volt means that you'll be able to use all your Ryobi 18 volt batteries in this particular trimmer, and you can adapt batteries over from different brands with third-party adapters. Just remember that you do this at your own risk. And the next pro is multi-head. Being able to use several different head attachments and several different configurations means that you'll be able to have a lot of versatility with this particular tool. Do I think it's the best design in the world? Not really, but it still is a nice feature to have, and this is definitely still a pro. Large guard. Overall, the large guard has its ups and downs, but at the end of the day, I still think it's more of a pro than a con, and it definitely will protect against any sort of flying debris that might be heading your way. So this is a pro. Better than I thought. When I originally purchased this weed whacker, I didn't have much hopes for it, and I actually intended on turning it into a power scrubber, but it remained a weed whacker, and it's been doing a good job, so this is a pro. Pivoting head. Overall, the pivoting head is a very interesting feature, and it comes in handy. It's good for trimming, and it's decent for edging, I guess, even though I don't do a whole lot of edging, but this is a pro in my opinion. And the first con is the balance. Overall, this is not a very well balanced tool, and I personally would have preferred to have maybe a slightly longer shaft on this particular tool to help with the balance. There really isn't much more you can do to improve the balance unless you use a much larger battery, and that really is about the only option that you have, since you really can't change the design of the head because of the way that it's designed. But at the end of the day, I think that a longer shaft would have improved this particular tool and helped with the balance, so this is a con. Weight. Overall, this is a rather heavy tool when you get down to it. It's not the biggest weed whacker, but it definitely seems to have a little bit more weight than some other weed whackers I use. And so if you're older or just don't have much upper body strength, this isn't probably the best tool or weed whacker to consider that's on the market. And last but not least, no sling. No sling is included with this weed whacker, and while you can buy a third-party sling, I just find it rather cheap not to include at least a mounting point for a sling. So this is a con in my opinion. Okay, and that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular weed whacker. When I first purchased this weed whacker, I really wasn't expecting that much, and delivered more than I was expecting. Does that mean it's a fantastic weed whacker? No, not really. I'd say it's above average, but at the same time, it's not something that I probably would buy again. I personally like weed whackers that have a longer shaft, that have a little bit better balance. But this still does a fairly decent job, and as long as you don't have a large property, I think this will be more than enough to fulfill your needs. And the option of being able to use the serrated plastic blades on this weed whacker will definitely help when you're dealing with those thicker and larger weeds. So would I recommend it? Well, kind of. I think there's better weed whackers for about the same price, so it really is up to you. And quite frankly, I can't really give an honest, objective opinion on the edging since it's not something I do regularly. So it just really is going to depend on what you think your personal needs are. So yeah. And that is it for this video. If you liked, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. God bless.